Simpkins, and thank you so much for coming and listening to and watching this presentation of mine titled The Path to Self-Discovery in Alice Walker's Everyday Use. I'm very excited to share with you the journey that I took while reading and analyzing this short story, as well as the journey that I took in creating this quilt that you see behind me. This short story was very interesting for me to read and analyze because there was so many different interactions and intersections of culture, specifically speaking to traditional Southern heritage and culture and traditional African heritage. And I decided to specifically focus on Dee or Wangero's path in the story as she goes from accepting her Southern upbringing and fully embracing her traditional African heritage as well. But before I get into the creation of this quilt and the specifics of that, I want to just provide you with a little bit of background information to help set the stage. So the story itself is surrounded around a mom and two daughters. The story begins with the mom and the younger sister waiting for Dee to come back home, and they are eagerly awaiting her arrival, but when she gets there, they notice a few things are quite different, and it doesn't seem like this is the same girl that they knew when she left. The reason for this is because Dee, or Wangero, she asks them to refer to her as Wangero because it is a traditional African name. She has gone through quite the journey in self-discovery because she went off to college, and in going to college she learned the truth behind a traditional Southern heritage and behind the history of that Southern heritage, and she decided to embrace her more African roots because she started to learn that she felt more deeply connected to those African roots themselves. So with this new knowledge that she found while in college, that was a rhyme, didn't mean to make it, but with that new knowledge, she also started to almost look down on her mom and her sister. Some critics argue that she was looking down on them, and she kind of placed herself above them, but other critics argue that it came out of a place of love, that she just wanted to inform her mother and her sister of the truth of what they were living in and what they were embracing. And I think that I agree more with the latter. I think that Wangero just wanted her mother and her sister to be informed. She just wanted to provide them with the same knowledge that she had been provided. But with that, in addition to the knowledge about the Southern heritage, she also begins to look at the Southern lifestyle in a more aesthetic view. She kind of places each of these traditional Southern objects, like the quilt or quilting itself. She looks at it like an aesthetic, like it is something that should be displayed and analyzed and looked at, but not necessarily used. She doesn't think that the quilts should be used for warmth. She thinks that they should be hung up on the wall to look at because they display a story. Whereas her mother and her sister think that they should be used. They should be used every day because they embrace that culture and they know how to quilt. So if it gets torn or ripped or whatever, they can fix it. But Wangero can't fix it. And so this causes a little bit of an argument between the family because they are looking at the same object through two very different lenses. And this is because of Wangero's newfound idea of what it means to be Southern and what it means to embrace that heritage. And this is the reason why I decided to create this quilt. This is really where my inspiration came from, because as I was reading it to begin with, I kind of looked at Wangero in a very negative light because she seemed to be very mean and condescending, and it looked like she didn't understand. But as I got into analyzing and looking at other critical papers, I started to realize that it was just because she had this new knowledge, that she had grown and she was in a new environment in college and she was able to embrace this other side of her that was silenced while she was at home. Embracing that African heritage was something that was very important to her, that shifted her worldview. And so that's why I decided to create a quilt, because I wanted to display Dee or Wangero's story in quilt form. So the quilt itself, each square of the quilt represents a specific piece of Dee or Wangero's journey to self-discovery as she faces the trauma of her Southern upbringing while also trying to embrace her African heritage. So, as you can see right here, the top 3 fabrics represent Wangero's Southern upbringing by channeling patterns that would be similar to clothing her family would wear. In the story itself, it talks about a dress that a grandmother would wear, or a suit or a uniform that a grandfather would wear, perhaps even in the Civil War. And so I really tried to channel that aesthetic with these top 3 fabrics because I wanted to represent where Wangero's story started, where she came from, that Southern heritage, although it is something that she looks at through an aesthetic point of view, although that is something that she looks at as a part of her past, I still wanted to embrace it because it is part of her story. It's still part of who she is. And in order to fully discover her true self, she had to accept that piece of her and move forward. Which is where we get to the second row. The second row shows Wangero gaining knowledge of her African heritage. It then shifts to merge the 2 types of fabric to represent the merging of cultures. So this first fabric right here, that is a map. And I used that because I wanted there to be a stark difference that showcased her going off to college and gaining the knowledge that she needed to move forward. I think that it's very common for many college students, once they move away from their home and they start, they step into this world that is brand new, that is unfamiliar to them. It's very common for many students to truly find themselves once they get to college. And so I wanted to have a fabric that really represented that, and that's why I decided to choose this one that looks like a map. This middle fabric here, I wanted that to represent the kind of first finding of her African heritage, that first step into embracing that culture. And so the reason that I decided to go with a striped fabric is because it's similar to this fabric up here in the middle. I didn't want to have such a stark difference because obviously as she was learning about these things while in her college career and as she was investigating this different culture, it wouldn't be a jump from one circle to another. There would be a sort of merging of the two. And so I decided to choose a little bit more colorful pattern but still keep those stripes. And then as we move into the third fabric here, this really represents that merging of those two cultures. It's more colorful, there's a bit more design going on, but it is still kind of channeling a similar aesthetic to this fabric here, where it's embracing both cultures and kind of bringing them together to merge them together. When we move on to the third row, this third row represents the turmoil Wangero faced when confronting her childhood trauma, and then the prospering of her newfound culture and heritage. So this first pattern here, the black and gray stripes, I really wanted that to represent the argument and the misunderstanding that was happening between Wangero and her family. Wangero coming back into her home and looking at the Southern upbringing, the Southern heritage as it surrounds her and as it surrounds her mother and her sister, it wasn't easy for her to do because she had kind of placed that as an aesthetic. She had kind of put it as on display rather than something that was actively being lived through. And when these two things meet, they clash. The merging of cultures on the outside looking in, it seems to be very easy to kind of have one foot in one foot in the other, but the truth is that when these two cultures came together for Wangero, they clashed pretty badly because her mother and her sister, they didn't understand Wangero and Wangero didn't understand them, and so a conversation needed to happen in order for them to understand one another. And so I tried to choose a little bit more of a chaotic fabric to represent that. But then as we move more towards these two fabrics here, I really wanted to embrace that African heritage that Wangaro had fully embraced by the time the story comes to a close. Throughout the entire story, Wangaro is trying to inform her mother and sister. She is trying to get them to understand that they can live a similar life to her, or at least they can at least they can see where she's coming from. This is hard for them to do, but it's still something that Wangaro is hopeful for. And I wanted to just really showcase that through all of this, through the turmoil and through dealing with that childhood trauma and through gaining knowledge and that merging of cultures, Wangaro truly did find herself. She was able to find a culture that she felt really embraced her, that she could fully embrace. And so I picked these two fabrics because I wanted to really showcase the embracing of that culture and how Wangaro was able to emerge a new person, or rather the same person, but with a new outlook on life, with a new understanding of the people and the world around her. So I'm sure that some of you might be wondering why a quilt. Ultimately, quilting holds a lot of weight in the short story because of its aesthetic significance. The quilt in the story is a main point of argument for Wangaro and her family because, as I mentioned before, Wangaro doesn't understand why they would use a quilt every single day, why they would use something that holds so much story, that holds so much heritage, why they would not just hang that up on a wall, and why they would use it for them to keep warm. But her mother and her sister are trying to get her to understand that they know how to quilt, that it's something that they were taught, that they learned from generations before them, and so they can patch the quilts, they can fix it with their own stories in the future, they can use their own fabrics in the future to fix, and then when her sister has children, then her sister can do the same, and they can keep it in the family and keep the quilting culture alive. And Wangaro doesn't really understand that, and so that's mostly the reason why I decided to make a quilt, because of the significance in the story. But African American women have also used quilting as a form of self-expression and storytelling for many, many, many years, dating back many years ago. It was a way for African American women during the time of slavery for them to come together and form a community and form a bonding together, to all participate in quilting and all share different types of quilting and different stitches and different fabrics. And it was a time for them to form friendships, to form storytelling. It's where the children would come and spend time with their mother and their grandmother and their aunts, and they would come together in a community and work on their own individual quilts, and then also work together on quilts. So it holds a lot of significance in history, and I wanted to try and celebrate that significance in history and pay my respects as well. Because as I learned about the history of quilt making, it really brought me in, and I learned a lot about quilt making through making this, through sewing it together. I did use a sewing machine. I didn't do it by hand, so I didn't fully embrace the culture, but I have a newfound appreciation for everyone that participates in quilting, because it is a lot of fun, and it does provide several hours of community and bonding to create friendships and all of that. So again, thank you so much for coming to listen to this presentation. I appreciate it so very much. If you have any questions, you can comment them down below, and I will be available to answer them. So thank you very much.